This is a crusade. This is a holy war against the deep state.
Where are the dictators? Where are the strong men?
Donald Trump is our instrument for retribution.
I'm going to fight for Christians. I'm going to fight for white people.
They have the Great Reset. We have the Great Awakening.
And why shouldn't I root for Russia? Because I am.
I want to see these people go through misery because of their grooming against our children.
After the assailant entered the home asking, "Where's Nancy? Where's Nancy?" Those are the very same words used by the mob when they stormed the United States Capitol.
I did nothing wrong.
Welcome to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, where we cut through the noise and help you make sense of the chaotic information space around us. I'm Griff Somke. On this special episode of the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, I sit down with author and activist Spencer Sunshine to talk about his new book, Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism, The Origins and Afterlife of James Mason's Siege. This is a two-part interview because it's basically two books. The first is a biography of James Mason, who is one of the most influential propagandists of white supremacist terrorism in history. The second part, coming next week, covers the group known as the Abraxas Clique, whose rediscovery and promotion of James Mason in the 1980s and 90s introduced him and his newsletter, entitled Siege, to a larger audience, and bear much of the responsibility for the spread of his toxic ideas. Thanks for supporting the podcast. And now, on with the show. Spencer, welcome back to Did Nothing Wrong. It's great having you on again, and I've been looking forward to this book since you told me about it.
Yeah, thank you. I had a really good time on the last show, and I'm happy to be here.
You said this book took you 5 years to write, and that does not surprise me in the slightest because it is exhaustive. And there is a lot of information here about some very obscure people and subjects that must have required a ton of original research and digging. Can you talk about some of the challenges you faced putting this together?
Oh boy. It wasn't originally a book. I had been in the car attack in Charlottesville, and I had really sort of rocked a lot of some of the fallout of that had rocked my personal life. And so I was interested in Siege because that's when people really started talking about Siege. There was a big spike in interest after Charlottesville, partly because the themes in there fit with what was going on really well. Basically, the argument you shouldn't have public demonstrations, that the authorities and the system won't allow Nazis to organize that way. And so Siege was being referenced a lot, but not talked about what was in it. So I was originally going to write an article for a think tank I was then working with. And it was going to be I was going to read Siege, which very few people had read.
Right.
Well, I would say other than Nazis, but I'm sure many white supremacists who say read Siege do not read Siege because it's turgid and it's very long.
It's really hard to read.
I think Mason's a pretty good stylist, but a lot of it's the artifact of Moynihan's editing, I would say. There's just too much stuff in there. Like the original newsletters that it's an anthology ever 6 pages long. They're not bad to read individually. I read all 72 back to back, and I do not. You should read the book instead.
Yeah, read about Siege. Do not read Siege. Read about Siege.
Yes, I was trying to start that hashtag, read about Siege. So I was going to write this article, and it was going to be a summary of what Siege and a little history of Mason. But as I was looking at the secondary text and the introduction to Siege, the details didn't add up. Like the years were wrong, and I couldn't tell, in the standard introduction to Siege, which was printed in the second edition, they go, oh, he formed this group called the NSM, and they sort of withered away. And I was like, well, is that the same NSM as now? Or they're kind of saying there was another group. So I found out that there was a Googling that there was an archive of his papers in Kansas. And so I went to Kansas, the University of Kansas, which is not easy to go to in Lawrence because Lawrence doesn't have an airport and I don't have a car. So I had to fly somewhere, and then I forget how I even got there. I think I took a 45-hour-minute Uber or something.
Oh, wow.
And then I realized when I got there, I was blown away that there were 60 boxes of correspondence alone that he hadn't deposited. He had sold it to him. And he was this inveterate collector who not just saved all of his letters, he saved carbons of his outgoing letters. And, this is a time in which, obviously, before email started in the 60s and ended around, I think, 03. He kind of ends, maybe 05. That all business has to be done over letters, right? Yeah. Internal business, personal correspondence and discussions so they're all there. It was this incredible slice of life of National Socialist life in the United States. People didn't keep archives, or they were destroyed in raids, or they were seized by the government or whatever.
Sure.
And he also had all of these tiny Nazi periodicals. And he's a Nazi. He's not a white supremacist. He's a National Socialist. All these tiny periodicals that you would never be able to find anywhere. Even you go in the big archives and they've got like a couple issues out of something that published for 10 years. So it was just amazing. And I had known that he was, obviously, that Michael Moynihan had edited the book, and that Moynihan was having read Kevin Coogan's article that was printed in the magazine Hit List called How Black is Black Metal, that people like Boyd Rice were around and involved, and Nicholas Schreck and Adam Parfrey of Feral House, this very important sort of extreme culture press that still exists. In the 80s and 90s, it was very important.
Right, right.
But their activities, exact activities in relationship to this were not clear, and they always denied any real connections. Boyd Rice, in particular, has been accused of being a neo-Nazi for decades. There's a picture of him with a Nazi skinhead leader, Bob Hike, that had appeared in Sassy magazine. Anyway, so there's been this argument about these guys, on and on and on and on and on. It keeps going on. And so I found their letters to him, and they were amazing. I read, they just lay everything out, and they talk about like discovering Mason and how to popularize him and like how deeply involved they were. I remember reading the letters from Adam Parfrey, and when Parfrey died, he had this huge obituary in the New York Times. I mean, this was like no irrelevant figure. Like movies started to be made from his books.
Right, right.
Mason put them in reverse order from most recent to oldest, right? So the oldest was at the bottom of the file. And I'm reading, and he's like, oh, blah, blah, blah. Hey, I haven't talked to you in a long time. And as you go down, it gets more racist and anti-Semitic, and you get to the bottom in the first letter, and he's ranting about Zog, the Zionist occupied government. And it was just amazing. I just got up. I was like, that's the fucking smoking gun there. Like, we're going to finish all these arguments about whether these guys were Nazis or what their involvement was.
Right.
They lay it all out in their letters to Mason. So then I was just like, oh, my God. So I came back to New York. And I was like, oh, it's one article. And I was like, oh, this is going to be 2 5,000-word articles. And there was so much material. It was thousands of pages of letters. And I realized all the secondary sources were mostly garbage. And even when they weren't garbage, you had no idea because there was so much garbage in there. Even in this Encyclopedia of White Power, edited by Jeffrey Kaplan, which Moynihan and Mason participated in, had the most information on this scene, but was largely wrong. Like the details. So it just made it worse.
Right.
And the first half was really interesting to me about these neo-Nazi splinter groups in the 70s, because there's not great documentation about this period of neo-Nazism. American scholars tend to collapse Nazis with American neo-Nazis with the rest of the white supremacist movement. And I think it's a significantly different thing. And so I realized there was this whole corner of several groups and people that had basically a terrorist wing had emerged outside of what was originally the American Nazi Party. And people know who Pierce is, William Pierce, who wrote the Turner Diaries.
Right.
But they don't understand that Pierce and these other figures, Mason, Tomasi, and others, actually ended up being like a wing of the breakoff groups. And it wasn't documented, and the documentation was scattered, and it didn't put it together. So I was like, oh, wow. So there's this whole part of 70s neo-Nazism that's not documented. And there's all these guys in the countercultural scene who've long been rumored to have these involvements, but the evidence is shaky or just pieces. And I'm like, here's all of the stuff where we can recreate their actual relationships, because they were very honest in their letters.
Right, right.
So then I sat down to write it, and I was like, all right, this is clearly a book. I think by 2020, I admitted it was going to be a full book. And then I wasn't used to dealing with correspondence. I have a PhD in sociology, and even though I've been historically oriented and worked in archives, it's generally been like magazines and flyers. It hasn't been letters. And it was like there was flecks of gold everywhere. And so you could see them, but you had to pick up each fleck to put them together and put the story together.
Right.
Like some of the stuff is in the best stuff is in published books, like an anthology called Art That Kills. There's damning stuff in there, but no one looks at the book. There's pictures of Boyd Rice and Bob Hike sig heiling. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so this stuff was all around, and much of it was public. You can look at Apocalypse Culture, the famous anthology by Adam Parfrey, and there's like a James Mason flyer in it. There's James Mason material in a book that came out the next year, The Manson File. Again, a very popular book. So this stuff was public, a lot of it, but it was just like here and there and there. And picking each flake of gold and putting them together just took forever.
Yeah, like stuff like Boyd Rice appearing on Tom Metzger from the White Aryan Resistance's show Race and Reason back in 1986 and being very open about this stuff. It's very hard for anybody to kind of collect all of that into one place because so much of it was obscure.
Yeah.
And you seem to have absolutely just nailed that.
The letters helped me put everything together. Like, it was known Rice appeared with Bob Hike, this picture in Sassy magazine in the 80s. Was this very popular.
It was a teen magazine. It was very, very popular.
Yeah, it was very riot girly. It's sort of like Teen Vogue, how Teen Vogue got popular under the Trump administration.
Right.
There was a picture from 89, and then it came out later, this interview with Metzger in 86. But the relationship between the rest of it, nobody knew. And the letters to Mason put it all together. And I was able to track his relationship with these neo-Nazis who all knew it. Basically, they all knew each other. And I was like, oh, he got into this clique of neo-Nazis. And it was like the 2 points could be then put together as part of a bigger arc.
Right. And you start the book off with a chapter about the Atomwaffen Division, who were a white supremacist terrorist group who were acolytes of Mason in the late teens. And it's very interesting that when you start digging into James Mason, you see that he had been waiting for this group or a group like this his entire life.
Yeah, I mean, he had hoped to inspire this sort of stuff in the 80s when he published Siege. It was a newsletter he published between 1980 and 1986. Failed miserably at that point. There were less than 100 copies made of it. I think I found his mailing list. I wish I had made a copy when he closed it. It was 66 names, and that included magazine trades. Yeah, and then it got picked up in the 90s when it got reissued in 1993 by Moynihan. And it achieved some popularity, but it didn't inspire anything, or maybe helped Metzger move towards leaderless resistance. And it got reissued in 2003 in an edition of 500, and those sold out. But the neo-Nazi movement had kind of collapsed at that point. The white supremacist movement collapsed by 2001, was definitely. By the late 90s, it's sort of been eclipsed by the militia movement. And so, yeah, and he had basically retired from doing this work. You know, he was rediscovered. The Atomwaffen had to track him down, and they rediscovered him. So, yeah, I mean, he loves it. It is what he always wanted. I don't think he expected it at this point.
No. I mean, his whole life has been spent kind of just being absolutely on the margins, even of some pretty marginal groups.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden, the end of his life, these kids show up and they're like, you're the greatest. We've read everything you've written. You're wonderful.
He had adored George Lincoln Rockwell, who founded the American Nazi Party. Mason never met him, but he was in the original American Nazi Party. And so now he got to be Rockwell in a way.
Right.
He always like fetishized these gurus, you know, it was a very kind of the Führer principle, with Rockwell. And then he made Charles Manson sort of take the throne, and now it's him in a way, right? And so he finally got to be the guy that he had looked up to, and the kind of guy he had looked up to when he was younger.
You do another thing in the book that a lot of previous work in this area hasn't, and that's drawing a very clear line between white supremacists and neo-Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
This seems like a bit of an old argument. If you look at the landscape today, it seems like, well, aren't they kind of the same thing? But back in the days of the 1970s here, when James Mason was coming into this movement, they definitely weren't the same thing. There was the Klan, there were the Nazis. These were different groups. You could be kicked out of the Klan for being a neo-Nazi.
Yes.
Can you kind of talk a little bit about that? What was the difference? Why did they draw a line? And why is it important people know that?
Sure. And I disagree with you a bit. I think definitely during the alt-right period, they tended to collapse into each other, but I think that they're reopening again. So National Socialism, how do we describe this? National Socialism was a German idea, right? And I think it was Goebbels who said at one point, National Socialism is not for export, right? There were fascists in different parts of the world, but really they weren't non-German Nazis.
Right.
In the United States, in the pre-war period, there was the big group, the German Bund. And there was also a group that was close to National Socialism, William Dudley Pelley's Silver Shirts. But the relationship between Nazis outside of Germany was always, even at that period, was always sort of up and down. The Bund was based in German-speaking immigrant communities, so that was less of an issue. After the war, I mean, the NSDAP was destroyed, the Nazi Party, in 1945, so there's no Nazi Party to tell people what was National Socialism and wasn't. So all these different groups then could pick it up and interpret it in their own way.
Right.
This is important because groups in the Middle East did this. Like in Lebanon, actually started earlier, but the Syrian National Socialist Party, which still exists and is part of the Ba'athist coalition of Bashar al-Assad. There are now groups in Iran. There's groups throughout Latin America. I wrote an article about this last year called Nazis of Color, documenting some of this. Lots of groups in Latin America, groups like in Malaysia, groups in Indonesia, and of course in the United States. But the important thing here is that Nazis, the NSDAP, were fetishized Aryans. Aryans are not white people.
No.
Right? Like Slavs were subhumans. And it got reinterpreted because there was no party left. Everyone could reinterpret it in their own national circumstances. And in America, part of what happened is that Rockwell said it's not about Aryans anymore. It's about white people. And this was important for things to come together. Before World War II, the Klan was like the radical edge of white supremacy. It wasn't an anti-system movement. And it wasn't a modernist movement. It wasn't interested so much in contemporary cultural forms at all. Which National Socialism was. I mean, it hated some of them, but in other ways, it was a very forward-looking, almost futurist. I mean, the Italians are more like this whole sort of, Mussolini was more into avant-garde politics than Hitler, but it was this revolutionary reaction, it's called sometimes.
Right.
It wanted something very conservative, but also something very radical and new. The Klan just wanted something very conservative. And they were into being white, and they were very patriotic, and they were into the free market. And all these things are not necessarily what the Nazis are into. And of course, we went to war with Germany. In fact, many post-war white supremacist leaders were in the American military. And at that time, America had been attacked by Japan. So it really was like, well, they've attacked us, right? This is not about racial supremacy. This is about your country attacking our country, and we're patriots. So yeah, definitely this period, there was not good relationships between National Socialists and the Klan, nor were there for quite a while after the war. There was one group of Nazis who became kind of crypto-Nazis and did have a following in the Klan, the National States Rights Party, but they were somewhat unusual in that. So it took a while. Rockwell forms the American Nazi Party, and there's like a predecessor group in 1958, but it gets going in 1959. And he never does get along with the Klan, or not very well. They're forwarding Southern segregation, and segregation, again, that movement is like, we want to keep things the way they are. And Rockwell and the National Socialists are like, well, we want a different future. We want this sort of almost messianic future.
Right.
And it didn't do it. People associated National Socialism with Germany. Even in the 1970s, Mason says, people keep asking us if we're German. This is not a German movement. And it was like a totalitarian state, and that's like very different than states' rights and free enterprise. And so the Klan was like just conservative, almost in a Burkean sense, like we want things to remain the way they are. And it wasn't any use to them. The American Nazi Party was tiny. It had maybe 100, maybe 200 members at its height. And they just made them look bad. In fact, there's a story when they took the Rockwell's famous hate bus into Montgomery, Bull Connor, the famous sheriff who, let the dogs out on civil rights marchers, forced him out of town. Huh. They were like, you're just here for the publicity. You're not helping us. And we have a big, huge movement. You're just a liability.
Right.
So it took a while, and it was really in the 1970s, and I talk about this a lot in the book, where the neo-Nazis, and the Klan didn't always, especially early on, the segregationist, the anti-Semitism wasn't an important part of this stuff until later on. Actually, until like later on in the segregationist movement, I don't think until the 1960s it became important to the Klan. So this was like a whole separate thing too about the Jews. The old Klan is like, they didn't like Jews, but the Jews weren't this fixation it is for the Nazis.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't like Jews any more than they liked Catholics, but they seem to have been in sort of the same ballpark in terms of how they felt. I don't know a ton about it, but it does seem like that. They don't fixate on them. I mean, Nazis fixate on them. That's right. For them, at the end of the day, it's not white people or Aryans. It's about Jews. You have to get the Jews first to unleash Aryan potential. Exactly. You would never have seen a photo of 4 Klansmen sitting in the front row at a Nation of Islam rally like you did with Rockwell. That's just,
it was an unusual thing to do. The Nazis could look at different ways of looking than the Klan did. They can make different alliances. They were open to thinking about things quite differently than a traditional American, like white supremacy, the way that white supremacy has been in the country since its founding. So they really only start to collaborate in the 70s, partly because the Klan starts to abandon this being conservatives and being more open to being revolutionaries.
Right.
Even Rockwell at the beginning was more of a conservative. And then as things went on, and this is why Mason's important, people are like, this isn't working. We're no longer they're no longer the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys are like the hard edge of Trump. They're like the white supremacists are like, we're no longer the hard edge of the system. The system has changed. The civil rights movement, the communists, and have succeeded. And so we need to be against the system. And this took a while to turn, but at this point happens what's called the Nazification of the Klan in the 70s. And the two do start working together more closely, not all groups. This is famous. The famous point of this is the Greensboro massacre in 1979, where it's joint Nazi Klan. They kill a bunch of leftists stupidly on a death to the Klan march, and they weren't ready and they weren't armed enough. And the Klan was like, all right, well, challenged us. And it's a whole, the Greensboro is a whole interesting story. And then they all got off. But that was actually a show in the book that this kind of collaboration had actually started a number of years earlier.
Right.
With a group called the White Confederacy around 1975. So this is this history of the two groups not getting along, and at the time they do combine. But there's always tension. Like at Charlottesville, they told the Klan, there had been a Klan rally a few months before, and they told the Klan they couldn't come. And they said, absolutely, you can't come in uniform. And there were a few Klansmen, but they would wear, like the one guy I remember.
Yeah.
He wore like fatigues with a blood drop patch. This is a Klan like symbol you'll see. But like otherwise, you wouldn't look at him and think he's a Klansman. If you didn't know what the blood drop is, you would have no idea. So any Klansmen who did go to that were very under the radar. There's lots of tension now. There's almost no Klan groups left now. I think there's only like a dozen.
Yeah.
But the Klan is seen as uneducated and rural and violent, and a lot of alt-right people, they're younger, they're modern, they're like into contemporary technology. It's just like, you can't imagine Nick Fuentes going out in a field,
burning a cross.
That's not what they're doing. So
No.
So the tension is opened again between the two, insofar as the Klan still exists.
And it's interesting that you bring up the Proud Boys as the analog, because we're starting to see that same sort of sense after January 6th, where the Proud Boys participated heavily in the insurrection at the Capitol, and a lot of their leadership ends up in jail as a result of this. You're starting to see the Proud Boys take more of an accelerationist, revolutionary end of the system type of turn. The individual groups are starting to go more in that no political solution direction. Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting to see history starting to kind of turn around again and maybe not repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes.
Well, this is generally what happens when there's like a big social or political movement that runs into barriers and it can't move forward. I mean, I think everybody knows if Trump, loses the election and there's not, even if there is an attempt to remove Biden or stop Biden from coming to power a second time, that parts of that movement will turn in a more revolutionary direction. I mean, It's almost inevitable, right? Like some people are gonna, even if they become like James Mason and start writing a blog, that nobody reads for many years and their impact is many years later, right? Some people just they have to turn more radical when there's a failure of a more moderate kind of political movement.
So let's talk about James Mason himself. Who was he and how did he end up getting involved in this world from such a young age?
So he grew up in I think it's sort of small, medium town in southern Ohio called, I think I always say it wrong, Chillicothe.
Okay.
Or Chillicothe. So you'll have to excuse me. I definitely should learn how to say that. If you're from southern Ohio, I apologize. And he was an unhappy teenager. He joined the party when he was 14, when it was still the original American Nazi Party. He saw a picture in a book called Extremism USA, and the picture showed someone from the ANP, the American Nazi Party, and on the back of their truck, they had a banner with their address. And this used to be pretty common. Like now you'll even see it now. It's stuff people have their website, right? But then you needed the address to write them, and he wrote them. He also had another kid who went to school with who had written them. He wrote them, and there was a youth group, the National Socialist Youth Movement, that he joined. And then he had lots of problems in school. He claimed he was going to go be a school shooter, but he called the party headquarters, and the guy who he talked to, William Pierce, who later became his mentor and became a very famous, advocate of violence, writing the book, The Turner Diaries, which helped inspire the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 that killed 168 people. So anyway, you have Pierce answers the phone. He says, well, come here to headquarters in Virginia, Alexandria, Virginia. And Mason goes there and hangs out for a few years. He's 16 at this point till he's 18, and then he becomes a full-fledged member of the party, and then he moves back to Ohio. So he gets involved from a very young age. He is the best lineage you could have to be an American Nazi than being in the original American Nazi Party that Rockwell was heading, because Rockwell was killed the next year in 1967.
Right.
And, he's already, when you become a member of these movements very young, and this happens all over. This used to be more common on the left, where there were familial socialist or communist families, occasionally anarchists. Like the kids were brought up that way. They know everything about the movement. They understand it intuitively. And so, because they've come of age inside of it. And they've seen, other people join the movement when they're 18 or 20, and someone who's 14 already has experience and they already understand how it's all working and they're more impressionable. So he just latches onto this and it becomes his thing. It's the center of his life. It certainly seems like.
And after George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the original head of the American Nazi Party, was shot by one of his own people, that movement ended up splintering quite a bit into lots of factions, lots of kind of alphabet soup type of things. It was a real, I don't know if you've seen this movie out there, but Monty Python's Life of Brian, there's a really great bit about the People's Front of Judea versus the Judean People's Front. And I'll probably link it in the show notes because it'll explain in a very short period of time what this was kind of like. You have these guys that would fall apart from the other group. They would be denouncing each other and criticizing each other's outlooks on it. And people were always quitting and resigning. And it's like the only thing they at that point hated worse than the Jews was each other. And it really kind of, from what I was reading, Mason stayed with the original American Nazi Party, but he was definitely aware of what was going on outside of that. And a lot of guys didn't. There was a gentleman by the name of Joe Tomasi, who was from the California area, and he ended up becoming a huge influence on Mason throughout the rest of his life, because Tomasi was not a theorist, really.
Yeah. Do you mean to explain the alphabet soup right now?
Yeah, let's explain some of that.
All right. So what happens, and this is very complicated, and I did my best to put a name, a glossary of all the names, and I even put a chart of when these groups broke away, but it's still confusing. It was confusing to me. I had to go through and make sure I had all the acronyms right, and I didn't. So the group that was the American Nazi Party becomes and there's great names, they roll right off the tongue. The National Socialist White People's Party.
Oh yeah, it's brilliant.
American Nazi Party, pithy. You remember it. This is just I don't know what you're doing.
National Socialist White People's Party.
Right. Yeah.
No.
So Rockwell makes a change right before he dies. So it's the NSWPP. And this is the group that all the groups splinter off of. I should say the group keeps going despite all these splinters. The splinters are what become important. The group keeps going, and in 1983 changes its name to the New Order, who become a rather inward-looking Hitler-worshipping cult. And I ended up corresponding. I wrote to Mason. He answered 50 questions of mine, and I ended up having a long email exchange with the guy who currently heads the New Order, so the current version of the American Nazi Party, named Martin Kerr. But what happens is all these groups, a guy named Kale takes over after Mason, and Kale's a decent theoretician. He's a good writer, but he has no charisma. And Rockwell really had this immense charisma. People were really dedicated to him, and Kale was just like a wet noodle, I guess.
Yeah.
And so people started breaking away. In 1970, there was a sort of triumvirate that ran the party, including William Pierce. And at one point in 70, Pierce and the other person are they write Kale a letter, and they're like, hey, you can't be the Führer. That's just not you. We need to split up the party officially between us. And so Kale's like, no, we don't, and forces him out. Also, the Chicago group is unhappy with what's gone on. There was very popular organizing in the Marquette neighborhood of Chicago in 1967 that Rockwell was part of. And Kale was moving all of the resources back to his headquarters. He was forcing everyone to sell there. They called them bookstores, but they were little, storefronts or headquarters building. buildings in an attempt to rein all of the different sort of, there's these little like local chieftains they're called sometimes. Right. He was reining them in. And the response to this is a lot of them quit and form their own small parties. So in Chicago, the group there split, and I'll try not to give the acronyms for them all. And they're important because they later do the Skokie incident, which it seems no one under Gen X knows. And they're lampooned in the Blues Brothers, group that gets thrown over. There's a funny story about this because it's so historically accurate. So these two groups bolt in 70, and then between 73 and 74, a whole bunch of the other ones leave. And the most important one for this story is Joseph Tomasi's National Socialist Liberation Front. I'm going to add one thing. Mason actually stays in the party. He forms his party in 75 and splits in 76. This party he forms is the National Socialist Movement, which is the one that still exists, the one that Jeff Scoop, who goes around giving talks as a former extremist while bashing the left, was the leader of.
Ah, yes.
Anyway, back to Tomasi. In 1974, he splits. He had a conflict with Cale, and he forms a group called the National Socialist Liberation Front. He's a very charismatic guy. He's a young guy, and he's in the LA area. He was a very successful organizer there. He's probably the most successful organizer in the old party, the NSWPP. He forms a new group, and they're modeled on all these early 70s radical new left terrorist groups like the Weather Underground, and in particular the SLA, the Symbionese Liberation Army, the people who kidnapped Patty Hearst. But there were other groups running around the New World Liberation Front stuff, and they were doing bombings and occasional assassinations, the SLA in particular. And so he basically took all of this stuff, and he was a very good graphic designer, and he took all this stuff. He borrowed all their slogans and their approach, this guerrilla approach, saying we'd build bases and link them together and then overthrow, the government in this sort of bottom-up kind of guerrilla strategy. Took their slogans and creates this group. He also was very countercultural. In the old party, they all wore the brown shirts with the swastika armbands. You'll see Mason still dresses like this.
Yes.
And he was like, no, you can dress in fatigues and had long hair, and people could come to their headquarters and get high and stuff. And so, it was very in tune with California, but it was Nazi stuff, and it ripped off all the new left stuff. So it was actually kind of a clever substitution. And then they started engaging in bombings, attacking the left. They did some stuff. You can go back in the newspapers and find them, like they tear gassed, I can't remember, a showing of this film about the Holocaust. They disrupted an event by the children of the Rosenbergs.
Right. There was an event for the Rosenbergs to reopen that case.
Right. They were the couple executed for giving atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. And their kids have always tried to reopen the case. And so like the NSLF disrupted a big meeting of them. So this was a new way to approach this stuff. It itself was probably inspired by William Pierce. He had formed an earlier group with the same name around 1969. It was like a front group to recruit college students. And their paper has a lot of new lefty stuff. It's not quite the same. It's very interesting. They're like, you should go recruit hippies as long as they're, quote, racially sound. And that group dissipated after a year or two, but its most famous recruit was David Duke. And so that's how Duke got his start. But I think that inspired Tomasi. It's pretty clear that inspired Tomasi to ape the new left. And then he opened this new space for Nazis to be involved in contemporary culture, in counterculture, not to care about drugs, not to care about sex. Like Mason always rails about how Cale really cared about haircuts, like people's haircuts. And it made them very a lot of young people, a lot of teenagers were becoming neo-Nazis at this point. And it really clashed with, they're joining this rebellious, movement that like has the sheen of genocide, even if they deny it. And then they're supposed to become super conservative culturally.
Exactly. So
this was a very different approach. It seemed fair. It seemed successful-ish. And then Tomasi was killed in a conflict with the parent party in the NSWPP and a guard at there's a whole story. Anyway, he gets killed by another Nazi. And then these different leaders, this group, the NSLF, continues through 1986. I think every leader is arrested at one time or another for attempted murder. But Mason loved what Tomasi was doing. He loved the graphic style of the stuff. He loved the approach. And he had written a bit to Tomasi, and then Mason was jailed for a hate crime. And while he was in jail, Tomasi died. And so when Mason got out, he actually joined this group, secretly joined this group under the second leader,
Right.
who I also corresponded with. He was in jail for pedophilia, which is how I knew how to find him, because prisoner numbers and addresses are publicly available. He was a very charismatic guy. I really understood him when people say pedophiles are very charismatic often. I was like, oh yeah, I can totally see that. Also had a photographic memory. He drew the cover of a magazine he had published in 1976 from memory.
Wow.
It was pretty astounding. He had incredibly detailed memory. Some of these other guys, I mean, it was 40, 50 years ago, are very fuzzy on the stuff as anyone would be. So at this point, Mason forms his own group. He's in 4 groups. He forms his own group. He's a supporting member of William Pierce's group. By this time, he's formed a group called the National Alliance. He's a secret member of the NSLF. He's still a member of Cale's NSWPP. And then he forms a new group called the National Socialist Movement. Now, he won't admit this. I mean, he will if you ask him directly. It's the same group that exists now in the aughts. It was the largest neo-Nazi party in the US. I think it had 60 chapters. And the funny thing is it did exactly the opposite of what Mason formed the group to do, which was not quite to be a group, but it was to encourage Nazis into armed militancy.
Right.
They wanted to move it to a more radical thing among the splinter groups. So the splinter groups were taking all different directions. The ones in Chicago were doing grassroots organizing, the one the Blues Brothers makes fun of. And they were very successful. They got thousands. There's this community that was resisting desegregation, and they became sort of the face and the voice of the community because no one else would help them. And so that was grassroots organizing. Pierce formed a formal organization with membership dues and publications in a newspaper and stuff. And that was one style. Some people kind of did the regular thing. They had a group and then they had these demonstrations that were really to pick fights. So there'd be a big counter demonstration. They get a lot of publicity.
Right, right.
There were the people who wanted to go guerrilla warfare. So Mason formed this group to encourage the other Nazis who had splintered away from the NSWPP to do guerrilla warfare. And all these groups, since they hated the parent party, were trying to work together to form a separate group because they had a lot of the talented, more interesting people. There's this project called the National Socialist Congress that most of them tried to work in and became an incredible nightmare of infighting. I go into this in excruciating detail in chapter 4 of my book is where everybody bogs down. But if you do read the book, every chapter has a little like abstract basically at the beginning. So you can read that and skip to the next one. This one, you might want to do it. They devolve into all this infighting and Mason loses basically. And the Chicago people win.
Right, right.
So out of this, he joins this other group where he sort of kills some time running their magazine. And then the NSLF, which hadn't dissolved, it sort of dissolves into another group, but then it comes back as Mason falls out with the leader because Mason fell out with everybody. And they try to revive it. And Mason starts Siege as the group's theoretical newspaper. He falls out with the leader of this tiny group after a couple of years, even though this guy's been his friend forever. And then he keeps going. They fall out over the Charles Manson thing. And then he keeps publishing it for 4 years. So by the end of this, it's just him sitting in a room with 100 or less subscribers.
Right, right.
He influences Tom Metzger, one of the major leaders of the white supremacist movement in the 80s and 90s. But other than that, it's like smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller till you're a party of one. But he's able to sit down, take all of his experiences, push them to the very edge, where he starts, he encounters Charles Manson because he writes to prisoners, declares Manson the new neo-Nazi guru, says that everyone should reject organizations, should reject the right wing in general, any kind of conservative outlook, should be revolutionaries. There's no point in trying to organize politically. The system, this is now it's called accelerationism.
Right, right.
The whole system has to come down or there's no chance. And I think he's totally right about this. There's no chance a neo-Nazi party is going to come to power. Everyone is against them. And that's true. Nobody, even Trump doesn't want a neo-Nazi party. Nobody wants them. So he's like, we have to, and he looked at Charles Manson. He's more influenced by Charles Manson than people give the credit for. He was like, like when Manson was the family were going to hide out in Death Valley and wait for the race war, the helter-skelter idea. We need to have the system collapse, and maybe that means cheering on radical left groups.
Anybody who was out there trying to do something against the system seems to have been okay with him at that specific point. He was very into, you mentioned in the book that he was very into serial killers.
Yes. And a bunch of neo-Nazis had become serial killers. He recognized they were 4 people who had been in his party became murderers. And he praised them and he praised other racial murderers and people doing bombings and mass disruption like the Atlanta child murders. If people remember in the 80s, I think dozens of black children were killed. He mostly was interested in racial murders or things with that or anti-Semitic, but mostly racial. And he hoped this would create chaos in the system. He wanted the left to even, at one point he says, oh, well, we hope the radical left fights it out with the government and also revolutionary racial nationalists like black nationalists. We hope they fight it out with the government, they'll weaken each other, and then we can sort of swoop in from behind, or we can exist, we can withdraw from the system, form these white enclaves, not to be separatists, but wait till the system collapses and then we can come and emerge. And white people will be so freaked out by what's going on, we can kind of come up as their savior and they'll follow us. So that's his plan. It's not a terribly sophisticated plan. It probably wouldn't have worked either, but I mean, he was trying to work through this problem of Nazis are feeling it, mass organizing. The organizations are highly infiltrated. They're easy to infiltrate if they're membership-based groups. Nothing's gaining traction, so we need to move further and further out. And there were all these racist serial killers, like some people he actually knew. Like the guy who shot Larry Flint, Joseph Paul Franklin, he had known from the original party. And Franklin was a serial killer going around. He killed I think up to 22 people, like mixed race couples and Jews, and he tried to kill Flint. And so about a fun side note, Flint was shot in my hometown, this little town called Lawrenceville, Georgia. My house was about a mile from where Flint was shot. And so that piqued his interest. This actually started in the 70s. And through this, he kind of got into Charles Manson. And Manson is a racist and an anti-Semite. Manson died while I was writing the book, as did Tom Metzger.
Yeah, Manson died in, I think, 2017? Yeah.
2018? No, after I started the book, so it was after 2018, maybe 2019. I know, the brain turns to goo.
No,
but Manson was super anti-Semitic, and he had carved a swastika in his head, and he had had an alliance with the Aryan Brotherhood. So he was, let's say, sympathetic to Nazism. I mean, obviously, he's his own guy, and I think he thought he'd make Manson a alkalite. Didn't quite work make Mason one, because Mason was always committed to National Socialism. And at some point, Charles Manson was like, no, you need to be committed to me, and it didn't work out.
Right.
Yeah, so he goes through all of these. So he gets involved in Manson. He gets influenced by Manson. I mean, Manson's at this point, you're not trying to appeal to anyone but super fringe people.
Yeah.
And that's part of Mason's strategy, is to find just the most radical thing and hope that people will be attracted by the most radical thing, and then you can try to politicize them and turn them into something a little more quote moderate or something.
And that was the last straw for his involvement with a lot of his contemporaries, a lot of the other people from the various Nazi parties, right? It was his support for Manson and his relentless pushing of Charles Manson. That was even too much for a lot of these people. They just couldn't.
Almost all of his few remaining friends bailed, except Metzger. And Metzger was like, I'm not on board with the Manson stuff, but I'll print the rest of your things or whatever. But you can't. At one point, he's like, "Can I reprint this?" But I got to remove the Manson stuff. And Mason's a cagey guy, so he was like, "Yeah, sure. I want you to promote this stuff." It was actually his move to Christianity a little later on that burned the last bridges, strangely. But
and you mentioned that he had been friends for most of his life with Tom Metzger,
yes,
who was the white Aryan resistance leader in Fallbrook, California, who was one of the first people to really recognize the potential in the skinheads and see what they were capable of, and spent a lot of time getting as much publicity as he could in various mainstream publications. He went on Oprah with his son. He ended up getting probably more publicity for the Nazi movement in that era, the early to mid to late 80s, than just about anybody did. And he was still willing to put James Mason out there.
Yep. Mason had contacted him. Metzger is an interesting story too. He's a kind of fascinating character. Metzger had moved from a more moderate position into a more radical position, but at one point he was being quite successful running for office in the early 80s in California. But he was getting more and more radical. And then and he was reading Siege. He says at some point, he's like, these newsletters just started showing up at my office. I think Mason just put them on the mailing list. as Metzger got more radical, he probably became more sympathetic to what Mason was doing, and they exchanged letters and stuff. So yeah, by the late 80s, Metzger's the main guy to take advantage of the Nazi skinhead explosion, which starts around 87 and really goes in full bloom at 88 when these TV shows Oprah and Geraldo are. And Metzger's totally into violence. He's a revolutionary. And so Mason's stuff is like just fine with him. You know, the Nazi skinheads are starting to murder people at this point.
Yeah.
Metzger's organization falls apart when some bonehead crew in Portland, Oregon murder Mulugeta Sarah, an Ethiopian man, in this fight. Metzger gets sued by the Southern Poverty Law Center and found under commercial law, and it's a civil lawsuit and held liable. That collapses his org, but Mason's already here promoting lone wolves and leaderless resistance, right? So a lot of things that Mason wants become very contemporary recently. And so he's like a forefather of a lot of things that now are somewhat normal, like working with Satanists and working with like what we would call, became edgelords and leaderless resistance and like refusal to work inside the system, and being an incredible sectarian.
Right.
So yeah, Metzger loves him. Metzger is good on TV. He knows how to speak in front of a crowd. At one point on this national show, it's long gone, the McLaughlin Report, he holds up a copy of Siege. There's an incredible video of this and says, man, you got to know what's going on, man. This is what, is really happening in America. It's like kind of an astounding moment. So that's his main and most important ally. Metzger published him. He was on the cover of one of the copies of the White Aryan Resistance newspaper and sold, it was probably his biggest distributor, sold boxes and boxes of Siege. So yeah, that was easily his most important ally at that point in his life.
And we go into Tom Metzger in further detail in episode 111 with Amanda Rogers, who's spent quite a bit of time studying him and is working on a book on Tom Metzger as well. So,
oh wow,
Metzger's another one of those fascinating guys who hasn't been really written enough about when it comes to his influence on the contemporary movement.
Yeah, no, Metzger died too. I think he died the day after the election in 2020.
Yeah.
I didn't know someone was writing a book on him. There is a book called 100 Little Hitlers that's it's about the murder of Sarah and partly about Metzger. But yeah, he definitely deserves a lot more attention. That's great. I'm glad to hear that.
Right on. So you mentioned that you corresponded with Mason for this, that he was willing to answer 50 questions for you about himself and his life and about his history for the book. What was that like?
I mean, Mason loves publicity. It was the strategy of Rockwell too. I mean, Rockwell picked this name, the American Nazi Party, and used the swastika to draw attention to himself. And so Mason has followed that. He really appreciated Anton LaVey of the Church of Satan, because LaVey kind of did the same thing too.
Yeah.
That you put out this wild thing, you get as much publicity as you can, and you'll draw people in that you then can work with politically. So I knew, and I read so many of his letters over the years, I sort of knew how he addressed people in talk. So I just wrote him a very polite letter. I knew he liked attention, and I knew he would talk to people. There's been a number of interviews and stuff with Christian Picciolini, who was a former Nazi skinhead leader, who I think might have known Mason or had some connection with him way back in the day, went to his apartment and interviewed him. Mason lives fairly openly in Denver, Colorado. So I don't know. I wrote him a very polite letter and I said, dear Mr. Mason, I've been working on what I did is, I said, will you answer some questions? But I sent him, because Mason was very proud of his lineage. He collected all of his stuff, these letters and magazines and stuff, archived himself. He created the book because he created this archive. I had made a list of all of the publications he had ever made in order, and I sent him a list of it. I also explained to him where the name Siege came from. That was an interesting experience. So yeah, he was like, yeah, sure, I love publicity, fire away. It was mostly detailed questions, because at that point I'd worked on it so long. There weren't big questions I had outstanding.
Do you think he was pretty honest with you about it?
Oh yeah, he's totally honest. He's honest to the point of being naive.
That's interesting.
He lost some internal, sectarian battles because he just couldn't see what was going on. People were working against him behind his back, and he didn't get it.
Yeah. You got a quote in there that's wonderful that says that this kind of public dishonesty is standard for U.S. neo-Nazis when they end up in the hot seat. Mason has stood out as a rare exception who has consistently owned up to his politics. Mm-hmm. And everything I've ever seen of James Mason, he doesn't seem like he's terribly, dissembling or kind of running away from anything that he's said. He's just, yeah, it's me.
Oh, no, absolutely. And there was a whole debate during the 70s thing. It was the same as the optics debate during the alt-right. It was almost exactly the same. He was like, groups have to, Rockwell's phrase was raise the swastika. And
Right.
he was like, we have to use the swastika in a group. We cannot hide in any way that we're Nazis. That they'll always find us out. I mean, it's true. He's like, they'll always find us out. And like, or we just become part of the system. Like we have to be super open about who we are and what we're doing. So yeah, he has no compunction about it. So yeah, that's his thing. A lot of others, I mean, you'll hear people, oh my God, a few years ago, I heard someone, like one group, I forget, maybe it was people in the NSM were like, we're not Nazis, we're National Socialists.
Right. I remember
and
that.
you're like you just like you what? How can you say that with a straight face?
It's only Nazism if it comes from the Nazi region of Germany. It's like, give me a fucking break.
Yeah, and so all these guys, they'll deny to your face that they're Nazis, even when they clearly are. I mean, this is a fairly standard, technique that people have. And Mason's like, oh no, we're Nazis. What the fuck are you talking about?
You quote one of those leaders from the 70s, Carl Hand, as saying, we must learn that we cannot win using symbols and labels of the past. I was told a long time ago to wear the swastika in the heart, not on the arm. To do otherwise is to invite animosity, not support. And I think a lot of those guys, that seems to be the part that they internalized, is just, we'll not cop to this. We'll come up with any number of euphemisms for why we are not really this thing that we very obviously are.
So Hand was the last leader of the National Socialist Liberation Front, and he was jailed in 1986 for attempted murder, which ended the group. He was so close to Metzger, I should say, that he handed the rest of the members of the group to Metzger, sort of fused with Metzger. He's like, the party's over, but go join war. And this happened after the quote is after he was released from jail. He formed the Racial Nationalist Party of America, which, I mean, some of it is they're like, Nazism is too specific. Asking people to hew to National Socialism is a very specific ideology. We're better off just saying we're white supremacists.
Right.
The Racial Nationalist Party of America isn't trying to hide that they're racists. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But the Nazi thing was very limiting. This is what David Duke discovered as his groups in sequence became more and more open. He was originally in the National Socialist Liberation Front, and then he was in the White Student Association and then the White Youth Association and the National Party. And he's like going out, making it more and more inclusive. So that's what Hand was doing. But yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of people are like, well, they're like, I don't know, anarchists and communists like this. At some point, they're like, yeah, organizing in my tiny communist group isn't getting anywhere. Like, I'm going to go into the Democratic Party or a labor union or something. That doesn't mean I'm not a communist. It's just like not the way to go organize.
So let's talk about universal order. You mentioned that earlier. The idea that by the end of where Siege was going, James Mason had had enough correspondence with Charles Manson that he was starting to put together this belief system, this new idea of what he saw as an evolution of National Socialism.
Yep.
Like this was National Socialism with all the parts that should have been involved in the first place.
I think I might call it National Socialism Plus in there. I can't remember if that made it or not. Yeah, so Manson influenced Mason's ideas, and Mason took some of Charlie, I'll call him Charlie just so we can make a distinction.
Fair enough.
So took Charlie's ideas and reworked them into reworked his Nazism, try to combine, let's just say, his Nazism and Charles Manson's views about certain things. And so one of them was Charlie's Gnostic views. And there's Gnosticism is another thing I wish someone would write about with this stuff that I couldn't really go into. It influences a lot of these guys. It influences Rice very explicitly. And I think it influences or parallels some of Parfrey's ideas about just putting out all kinds of extremes in order to sort of puncture reality. Like there's some reality below it. If we just throw out all these extremes, somehow we'll be able to puncture the false veil of the modern consumer society or whatever.
Right.
So, but part of it is Mason, after he splits with the NSLF in 1982 and he falls out with this guy, Carl Hand, he starts publishing Siege under the name Universal Order, which was suggested by Charles Manson. And his idea now is that it's very much like traditionalism, if people are familiar with this idea.
Right, big T traditionalism.
Big T traditionalism, that there's an underlying natural order that it's racist and anti-Semitic, and that the Jew-controlled decadent society is perverting this. And we need to go back to this, but also you can't destroy this idea. It's a biological thing. This plays into ideas about Hitler's divinity that became popular in the Nazi scene, popularized by Savitri Devi. And it also became like, you can't destroy the Nazi movement. It is always there. This is a true part of the human experience. And so this was part of the, like, we can hide out and the system can collapse because it will always be there within us. He's very vague about what it means. It's a kind of spiritual, he says he's an atheist, but it's clearly a spiritual idea. At one point he's like, oh, Christians and Satanists and communists can all be part of universal order. Although I think the communists would be very surprised that the intrinsic biological underlying structure of life is, Aryan supremacy.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure the communists aren't going to be part of this.
It's not really a big one with them.
Yeah. And so it's a sort of like, he talks about balance and stuff. It's really vague, but it does drive him out of an idea, out of a tie to traditional National Socialism, and it creates a sort of spiritual element, and it creates a tie to Charlie. It's again like one of the basic Gnostic ideas is like, we live in this sort of perverted world that's something of an illusion, and underneath it, which if we look inside, we have a spark of the Godhead, and we can like become connected to the Godhead if we somehow reject this false veil of what looks like reality. Right. So for him, the national, universal order is the Godhead, and the false veil is like the Jewish controlled Zog, modern consumer society, blah, blah, blah.
It's just amazing how many of these ideas keep coming up with some of the really terrible people these days, even guys like Andrew Tate, when they talk about, it's all the Matrix, and they're saying very similar things to the idea of, we need to take all of this off. We need to throw the scales from our eyes and see who's really controlling this. And this is how we break free.
Right. But some of these are very old religious ideas, right? So, I mean, a lot of this stuff is reworking. People often point more on the radical left, but I think it's true on the radical right. Like, point to, Christian Gnostics about having these ideas that then keep that structure of that idea keeps percolating, certainly in Western culture,
Right. Thanks for listening to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast. If you want to hear more, you can find us on the web at didnothingwrongpod.com. Please make sure you subscribe to get our content straight into your inbox. You can also follow us on Twitter at GRZABJJ, GRZABJJ, as well as DNWPod. We're extremely grateful for paid subscriptions and donations that allow us to keep doing this important work. Thanks, and remember, everyone mentioned did nothing wrong.